on human rights accountability during COVID. I'm Tegan Insel. I'm the Secretary of the Board here at Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation, and I'm really happy to be opening this webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's discussions. We have a fantastic list of panelists that Sabina will introduce in a second. But for now, I'll just take us quickly through the overview of the webinar. But firstly, yes, I'm Tegan. I'm the Secretary of the Board. I joined PAF about a year ago, actually. I started doing a little bit of contributions to the website content as I wrote my bachelor's thesis on pharmaceutical accountability and intellectual property law. And now I'm an international human rights lawyer with an LLM, and I'm really happy to be here today. So a quick outline of the event today. Myself, I'll be welcoming and introducing the foundation quickly. And then Katrina, our advisory board member, will be introducing more about the topic and a little bit about the GCCP project. Then Rosalind, our fantastic researcher who recently joined us too, will be talking a bit about the goals for the project and what we want to talk about today. Sabina will then introduce the panel members and moderate the panel discussion. This will take up the majority of the webinar, and I'm so excited to hear all of the interesting ideas and sort of new directions that we can go with the project. We'll have then some concluding statements from our panelists, and we should be finished hopefully in about an hour and a half. Okay, so the meeting is being recorded. So if you could turn off your cameras and mics when you're not speaking, that'd be amazing, so that everyone can see the people who are speaking. And other practicalities to get through. But yes, if you have any questions or comments, please write them into the chat, and we will take them into account for the panel discussion. And anything else? No, that's all. Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining, because we have quite an international audience today, which is fantastic. We have people from Chile, India, Norway, Germany, France, the UK, Switzerland, of course, the Netherlands, and myself, I'm joining from Finland. So very exciting. So just to introduce the Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation, I'm sure many of you are already aware of what we do, but just a quick overview in case you're not. We were founded in 2018 with the main mission of ensuring that medicines and other medical technologies are available, affordable, and accessible to everyone. And we do this on the basis of the human rights to health, life, and essential medicines. So it really has a human rights basis in everything we do. The tools that we use to achieve this vision, the main things that we do, firstly, we monitor the human rights responsibilities and the practices of pharmaceutical companies. So with the GCCP project, we're looking at the responsibilities that companies have and how they sort of follow through on these responsibilities. With this information, we want to really get it out there into the world and share our findings with not only the general public, but with also the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So let them know more information about their responsibilities and how they can act to work in line with them. If this doesn't work, our last resort is to use legal proceedings. So we use these legal strategies to take pharmaceuticals and hold them to account if they're setting unreasonably high prices for medicines or medical technologies. So that's just a little brief introduction about what we do as a foundation. And now I'm really happy to pass on to Katrina, who will talk much more about the issue itself and the history of the GCCP project. Thank you.
Thanks, Tegan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katrina Perhudoff. I'm a senior research fellow and co-director of the Law Center for Health and Life at the University of Amsterdam. And I was a founding board member of this foundation, and I've joined the advisory board together with a number of other people I admire very much. And I've been involved with the good COVID-19 company practices since Wilbert first came to a board meeting and enthusiastically talked about this idea of his to monitor human rights responsibilities of pharmaceutical companies, particularly producing or developing and producing COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. And this was in 2020, after the pandemic had been declared, and we were given the decades of experience amongst the members of Farma Verantwoording. It was clear that we could see the writing on the wall, and soon, if and when vaccines and therapeutics would be developed, there would be a real struggle to get them to some of the poorest places in the world. And so we were thinking early on, how could we monitor these responsibilities in real time? And we came up against two challenges. One was a normative question of, well, what are these company responsibilities in the context of this pandemic? And of course, we have international guidance on this issue, the 2008 guidelines on human rights responsibilities of pharmaceutical companies. Those are what we call the Paul Hunt guidelines. And that's also the basis for this project, because they were the most detailed with regards to what companies should be doing. And then you also have the similar and complementary 2010 UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, put forth by John Ruggie. Those are more general, and we can speak about those during the panel discussion. We also saw that when looking at the normative responsibilities of companies, there had been a number of government endorsement and action on this issue, and also that pharmaceutical companies had proactively committed to the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights. So we took all of this together and thought about really distilling out key human rights responsibilities that are relevant for developing and making available COVID vaccines and therapeutics, and linking those with practical steps that companies could do during this crisis. And then the practical challenge that we came up against was that we needed a tool to evaluate company behavior. Of course, we're familiar with our colleagues at the Access to Medicines Foundation who have long ranked company behavior. But we also identified that this was not only in relation to the COVID-19 product. So we were interested in something that was looking at companies plus the product. Next slide, please, Tegan. So the initial aim of this project, when we were setting our first step, we thought to identify the normative human rights responsibilities of companies. This would essentially look like a checklist. And to assess whether vaccine and therapeutics developers are realizing these responsibilities. Now, in the next this slide and in the next few slides, I refer only to vaccines mainly, just to give an easy snapshot of what we were doing in 2000 and early 2001. But of course, we've done this for therapeutics as well. Next slide, please. So we used a literature review of various legal norms and ethical standards, mainly relying on the Paul Hunt guidelines. And then we went through iterative rounds to refine company responsibilities, also seeking expert input from advocates and experts that we work with from Knowledge Ecology International, Medicines Law and Policy, Wemos, Innovarte, Unitaid, and others. And it's around this time that our very first research assistant, Tessa Jolen-Jager, joined. I think she's also on the call today. So Tessa, please jump in if anything needs to be clarified, because you were the eyes and ears on the ground. So then we evaluated the behavior of 12 companies manufacturing 9 vaccines and 3 therapeutics. You can find these results on our website. And basically the evaluation was an online search of their websites and other information using a structured protocol. And then we crowdsourced various information from listservs and collected company responses to a questionnaire. So we essentially mailed out our good COVID practices and asked for a response from companies on each item. And we got a number of responses back, which was helpful in triangulating and verifying the information that we'd found. And we essentially scored behaviors on using a 3-point stoplight system. So we had 2 independent analysts And if they were unsure about which score to give, then they consulted with a third person. Next slide, please. So I, again, just show the results of 4 vaccines producers to illustrate how this works in practice. Basically, we ended up with 18 criteria after various iterative rounds, and we related them to 4 kind of key human rights responsibilities. We have accountability. So the 4 key areas are listed in the middle: accountability, then commitments, equality, non-discrimination and equity, and transparency. And you can see the stoplight scoring system on the right-hand side for the 4 companies. Basically, as of January 2021, when we published this for the first time, we found that the vaccine developers performed best on transparency matters, which are found near the bottom of the screen on the right. That's where you see they're scoring the most greens. And at that moment in time, performing worst on the accountability measures, which are at the top. So accountability measures, for example, relate to publishing a global access plan for their products and committing to comply with human rights standards. So in this process, doing this for the first time, I could say we identified 3 trends. And the first was that the present pandemic reinforced human rights responsibilities that Paul Hunt had identified through a consultative process already back in 2007. So in other words, these responsibilities are still very relevant in the current pandemic. And with the 4 arrows on the screen, I've pointed out some of these responsibilities that remain relevant. So committing to comply with human rights standards during product development and marketing, for example, or committing to provide IP and other knowledge to various access pools, committing to technology transfer, which is an established human rights responsibility, still very relevant. And at the bottom, publishing the text of licensing agreements, still very relevant. So that was the first trend. Could we go to the next slide, please? The second trend we identified is that the pandemic could really be crystallizing or clarifying other potentially new human rights responsibilities. Maybe they're not new, but maybe they haven't been specified as such yet. And some examples of these are shown in blue. We've identified at least 5 different areas that human rights, or at least the human rights responsibilities conceptualized by Paul Hunt, they don't touch on very much. And at the same time, these various actions are really crucial to equitable access to pandemic products. So some of these responsibilities could be committing to nonprofit or fair pricing. That's not touched on by Paul Hunt's responsibilities. Publishing R&D costs for vaccine development action is also important. Publishing a company's profit margin on their product could be important. Publishing a company's own production capacity, very important in this pandemic. And interestingly, the current conceptions of companies' human rights responsibilities don't mention company production capacity. And publishing the final one, well, you read it. So those are the key trends we identified. And then when we put these 2 findings together, we could come to a third trend, which is that company behavior actually, in this pandemic, actually legitimized some of the existing human rights responsibilities. And some of these, I call them new. I don't know if we should be calling them new, but let's, for simplicity, and some of these new human rights responsibilities. So for example, Moderna committed to not enforcing its patent rights during a pandemic. And AstraZeneca had at least 4 tech transfer agreements with producers in different regions of the world, which could help scale up production and make sure vaccines are getting to those areas. So those are very much in line with existing human rights responsibilities, and we see companies taking those steps proactively. And then we have 2 other new human rights responsibilities we might want to consider as a result of this pandemic. And we see that companies were already taking steps to discharge those responsibilities. For example, by committing to nonprofit vaccine pricing for the duration of the pandemic, and by proactively disclosing their production capacity. And this is just a brief overview of what we learned in this first iteration of the GCCP, and of course there's a number of findings that are specific to each company and to each product. So if you're following those measures very carefully, they can also be very insightful. Next slide, please. So what we learned from this first step that we made was that we could practically translate company human rights responsibilities into actions that are relevant in this pandemic. Our aim in this step was to develop an easy to read and real-time snapshot of company behavior regarding specific COVID-19 products, and we found that companies also legitimize some of these human rights responsibilities by taking the steps that we had listed in the scorecard itself. And some of the lessons that we learned from this that I think, well, that I would very much like to discuss in the panel are whether some of the human rights responsibilities as outlined by Paul Hunt in 2007, whether they are not due for some upgrades or updates. A second question that I'd raise is whether we've identified the best company actions that relate to these human rights responsibilities. Maybe there are other more relevant, more easy to practically measure company actions that we should be monitoring instead of what we have listed here. It's probably worth noting that establishing or just adding one company to the scorecard is quite a labor-intensive undertaking, and also to keep it updated. So I think there's some practical questions around execution and maintenance of the scorecard that we could also discuss. Then, of course, the scorecard is based mainly on online and company reports that we, to the best of our ability, try and triangulate. So this also raises the question that we don't know what we don't know, and we're mainly relying on what is being said and what we can identify also through press statements, and that, of course, leaves some of these things open to interpretation. And another point is that it's difficult to measure the impact of company behavior in a sort of very direct fashion. And would be interesting to potentially add this to the scorecard in the future. In other words, to connect company commitments with some very concrete measures of access. And an important mediator there is of course what governments are doing. So the other question we might raise is how do we consider the government's role in this story? Because actually the government has the primary responsibility to ensure the respect and fulfillment of human rights. And a question to some of the practitioners on our panel would of course be who will use the scorecard and how. So with these key lessons learned and questions, I'd like to just conclude this part and pass it over to Tegan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting to learn a little bit more about the background of the GCCP, and here's Rosalind to talk about the future of the project.
Thanks, Katrina, for that great introduction to GCCP. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rosalind, and I'm the new researcher for the GCCP project. I recently joined the Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation after completing my LLM in International Human Rights Law. And that's when I found out about GCCP. And I remember thinking, this is really a hybrid between an advocacy tool and something that's based on very academic concepts. And I think this hybrid is what's really interesting. It's really an attempt to operationalize Paul Hunt's human rights responsibilities for pharmaceutical companies. And they're applied to the current crisis in a very practical way. So in a way, the tangible aspect of the scorecard is its most attractive aspect, at least in my opinion. It has this legal rights-based foundation, but with really concrete criteria that companies can follow to take action for equitable access to medicines and to better their practices. So the scorecard that was published in January of this year is it's really a first step on the journey to stronger pharmaceutical accountability. And so far, we have what we believe to be a solid, legally defendable, rights-based foundation for the project, and we're now looking for the best ways to implement it. So our intention for this webinar is to establish how to use GCCP to develop human rights responsibilities into more serious and concrete obligations for industry. We plan to update the research, adding new vaccines and new therapeutics. A lot has changed since the outbreak of the pandemic, and there's potentially room for improving or expanding on the criteria themselves. And we also need to establish how the new public health challenges that have arisen this year during COVID-19 can be better reflected in the scorecard. So we're now talking about booster shots and vaccinating children, and these all raise new public health paradigms that need to be considered in GCCP. So all in all, we want to make the GCCP into a stronger and more relevant tool. And this is why we've gathered a panel of experts in the field of access to medicines to get input on what directions the GCCP could go in and which possibilities you see to make use of the scorecard on policy or advocacy levels. And also to introduce our work to you. We really think it's a valuable project that could go far. And finally, I would just like to add that our work always really relies on partnerships with other NGOs to strengthen our standing. Some of our partners are attending today, so thank you for joining. And we look forward to continuing to work closely together in the field of access to medicines. So I'll now give the floor to Sabina, who is a PAF board member, and she'll introduce the panel members to you. Thank you.
Let's unmute. That's much better. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sabina Voogd. I'm a board member of the Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation. In daily life, I'm a trainer and coach and advisor on advocacy for a better world. But today, I'm the moderator of the panel. I sit here together with Emily, who will pass on incoming questions from the audience to me. So please post your questions via the chat, and I aim to weave your questions into my questions. I will now introduce the members of our panel. I'll start with Luis Villarroel-Villalón. He is professor on intellectual property rights and has been working as an IP lawyer and as advisor to the Chilean government, amongst others, on the free trade agreement between Chile and the United States. He is director of Innovarte, a non-governmental organization whose mission it is to build capacities to design, understand, and use a balanced system of intellectual property standards that promotes, in the light of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the economic and social development of the peoples. Katrina Perehoudov, you already saw her. She is a pharmaceutical policy expert, a health scientist, and legal scholar, and her research is focused on the development, formulation, implementation, and evaluation of law and policy interventions in the field of pharmaceuticals and public health. She's a member of our advisory board and of HAI, and she's the brains behind the GCCP scorecard, together with Wilbert Banneberg, the chair of our foundation, who has become grandfather today again. So we'll excuse him for not being here and we'll congratulate him on this wonderful event. Mr. Hans Hogezeil is global expert on essential medicines, medicine policies and health systems in low and middle income countries. He retired as a WHO Director for Essential Medicines in 2011, and he's a founding member of the Global Health Law Research Center in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, which operates at the interface of international law and public health. And he also was professor of global health there until 2019. Interesting for this panel is that he is also a member of the advisory board of the Access to Medicines Foundation, which Katrina already mentioned, because the foundation publishes the Access to Medicine Index. Kirsten Meer is a pharmacist with 20 years of experience heading university hospitals, pharmacy departments, and in pharmacovigilance at the Norwegian Regulatory Authority. She has worked at UNICEF and WHO and taught good pharmacy practice in countries like Botswana, Mongolia, and Albania. And since 2000, she has been engaged in the WHO HIGH project on developing a methodology for measuring medicine prices, for which she was the principal author of the first edition of the manual, and later in activities arising from that. She is now a board member of HIGH Europe. Winne van Woerden is the last panel member. She has a background in global health sciences, and she has worked as policy advocate, communicator, and campaigner on issues of health equity and social justice with several civil society networks, including WEMOS, the Commons Network, and Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, UAEM. And she was part of the Dutch National Board of UAEM in 2019 and 2020. And she's currently obtaining a second master's in political ecology and degrowth economics from the University of Barcelona. So please, panel members, show yourselves. And I will talk to you on the basis of two sets of questions. One set will be about the scorecard itself, the underlying legal principles and the concept and criteria in the scorecard. And the other set will be on how to make the scorecard a stronger or more relevant tool in relation to international cooperation and as a tool for policymaking. Each question I will pose to a specific member of the panel, but others can indicate that they want to answer too. Or react, and people in the audience, please send in your questions via the chat. Okay, I'm going to start. With the good corona, the legal principles, sorry. The good corona company practice, the good COVID-19 company practice scorecard is based on human rights related to health, in particular to the principles as formulated by Paul Hunt. And his human rights guidelines make companies responsible for adhering to these human rights, but it's not yet a legal obligation. The GCCP scorecard can help with monitoring how these human rights principles are being followed by pharmaceutical companies. The question is, and I want to pose it to Katrina, in what way could the GCCP be a tool for transforming responsibility to legal obligation for companies?
That's a good question. I think first and foremost through awareness raising. So by increasing either societal expectation that companies, when they're producing a product such as a COVID vaccine, that they adopt certain behaviors and do certain things proactively and avoid doing other things in order for the greatest societal benefit from that product. And then from beyond awareness raising, I think if one really wants to see these responsibilities translated into legal obligations, then finding a domestic legal system that is willing to enforce them on companies, I think that's the best thing that we could aim for, really.
Mm-hmm. Do other people in the panel want to say something about this question? Yes, Hans, please.
Yeah, I would challenge the question. I would ask myself: is creating a legal obligation, is that the way forward? Is it realistic, and is it going to do what you want? In the end, I think you want to change the behavior of the companies. Is it not? I mean, that's what we want. And I agree with Katrina's first point, that awareness, just basically letting them know what the world expects. On the one hand, you can say these companies are not stupid and they're clever. And on the other hand, some companies may not actually be so much aware of it. I've seen that recently. I mean, for example, a talk from the Access to Medicine Index, where 20 companies have been followed for 12 years. They know more or less what's expected. Now we are starting to biosimilar companies. They have no clue. They have really no clue. They are not used to this way of thinking. So in that sense, without being naive, I think just being very clear what you expect from the companies is already a good thing. So translating your principles into even much more practical guidance is one thing. That's why I like the Access to Medicine Index, because it's like a wish list. By just making very clear what do you want, what do you expect. So that's the expansion on the awareness thing. Then for the Access to Medicine Index, we have, of course, we want to do the same thing. It's maybe other companies, other medicines, but basically the same thing. And there's two more things. When we have the biannual Access to Medicine Index report, we go very wide in the press. I mean, that's a huge campaign. That's 3, 4, 5 people full-time working with campaign, with all the presses. That's one huge thing. It always ends up in the Financial Times and all that sort of thing. So that's one thing, and that includes also governments, speaking to governments, etc. Governments read newspapers, basically. So if it's in the newspaper, that helps. And the third one, and I haven't heard you mentioning it at all, is the investors. I mean, the Access to Medicine Index has a very structured relation with the huge institutional investors. Now, after 12 years, I think it's more than 100 investors, and the total invested capital they are looking after is 13 trillion. So $13,000 billion. And these are investors that have chosen to officially recognize the index as one of the things they look at when they look at companies. So if you can convince investors that this is sort of green enterprise or human rights based is in line with modern enterprise, which is with societal responsibility towards equity, even with the climate and the future of that sort of thing, I think that is much more likely to have any effect than the legal measures. I wouldn't exclude the legal thing, but I would think that's very difficult you would have to change laws and things like that, unless you can go to existing laws. But to me, with international companies, I think that's a rocky path. So I would go for others. More systematic awareness raising in the company, outside the company, and focus on the investors.
Yeah. Thank you, Hans. That's really interesting, and we will get back to how to make use of the scorecard as a tool in the second part of discussion. So then we can also talk more about investors, for instance. But thank you for now. Vina, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Wait, I'll first lower it. Yes, first of all, thank you for asking me to be here. Very, very nice to be in that discussion about access to medicines again. It's been a while for me. So I wanted to react on Hans' last point on the role of investors, because as I think many people here know, what UAM is really doing is looking at the role of universities as really an important actor in this whole system of biomedical R&D that we have. So I think indeed when I was reading through the GCCP, I was kind of searching for who is gonna like ask these companies to take these rules into account when they within their development of COVID products. And I think indeed investors can be a very important role here, but universities as well. And then again, the investors through their when they are funding universities, and when universities are then again licensing to companies their products. So I think this is very well. I think it's important to take this kind of dynamic into account with public investors, private investors, universities, and then companies again when you think about this GCCP. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then I would like to ask a question not so much focused on the companies, but more on the states, because my question is, how can the GCCP contribute to stimulating access to essential medicines as part of the progressive realization of the right to health by states? Does somebody want to say something about that? I have written down Hans, So if you like, you can start on that question, or maybe Kirsten. Luis?
Kirsten, you want to start? I can speak, but I don't want to speak as first one. I can speak, but maybe other ones would like to speak.
I see Luis wants to speak.
Oh, no, but Hans, you can go, but then I will chip in.
All right. Okay. Yes, of course. Well, yeah, yes, of course, human rights obligations basically from the state. That is true. We don't have to repeat that. I'm just trying to think more of the role of the state in this COVID business. And the first thing is a role which has been played already, and where I think they have, most of the governments have actually failed to do what they could have done. That is when the state is entering in PDPs or starts to pay for the research. And that is the moment that the state can ask from that individual company something in exchange, and specifically what in the Access to Medicine Index we would call an access plan, an access strategy, basically saying, okay, you get that money. How are you going to? What is your plan to make this thing available to everybody? What is your pricing strategy? What is your IP strategy? What is your licensing strategy and things like that? And make that obligatory. And we touch a bit on the legal, because if that is entered into a legal contract, it becomes legally enforceable. Now, we all know that the EU has dropped the ball on that one with AstraZeneca, and that on many occasions that has been forgotten. So this is one of the first, that's I think maybe one of the few moments the state has an influence, which is in the beginning, and especially when we talk about missing essential medicines, so developing essential medicines that we really need, and for which there is, for one reason or another, is no economic case, like vaccines usually are, but I can think of other medicines as well. That is the role of the state or the big private foundations who make that money. And we see also that when you look now at the availability of access plans, that among medicines in the pipeline, in the R&D pipeline, late in the pipeline, where there have been PDPs, most of them have access plans, and the drugs that have been developed without PDPs, so in private let me say enterprise, or it's a more tricky one, and that I think is more exploratory. That is this whole concept of, let me say, well, there's not even a name for it. What I want to say is too much profit, irrational profit, abuse of patent. I mean, when you think about Pfizer. Now, how many, let's make a rough calculation. How many vaccines have they sold? Maybe 3 billion or something, 4 billion or something. 4 billion. Now, well, let's say $13. That's 55, that's $60 billion they have earned on something which to do research was maximum 600 million. At a certain moment, you can say, when is profit enough? And when is the government going to say, stop, now you're abusing your monopoly, and we're going to break your monopoly. So when it comes to, when I hear Pfizer saying that they are thinking of a price of 140, 150 euros for the vaccine as soon as the acute phase of the pandemic is over, that's the moment for a compulsory license. I think that's abuse of patent. Yeah. So that was another government possible action. Let me stop here. There may be more. Over.
Yeah, well, there was also a question from the audience. What about setting purchasing conditions when the states are buying medicines?
I think Australia is a good one. They have, you can call that a buyer's strike. They have refused to buy, I think, certain essential drugs. I think the Hep C vaccine, the sofosbuvir, but earlier it was for some of these painkillers which are too expensive. Australia has a history of just simply refusing to buy unless the price comes down. Yeah. But then you have to be tough against your population. So you have to withstand that in Parliament and say, listen, we're not going to buy that because it's too expensive and it's not worth it.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Luis.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Hans has told us everything, so it's kind of hard to
sorry.
No, it's good. No, I love it. No. Well, I mean, first, a general observation is that whatever does the government, it will be in part driven by civil society. because either it's a political measure or either is a law, it will be a response. Because the government is people like us, and they are kind of learning from what they see around them. So it's very important. This enterprise that you are working is in the sense that it legitimizes certain standards that the governments will look and sort of like help them, to take action. As normally governments are afraid of being not liked by people. So then if they're going to, even if they like some measure, if they don't see civil society asking for it or other political power asking for it, then they will not do it. So this legitimize, actions. So that's it. Is very important to keep in mind. Also, as been mentioned, the issue is that there are ideas here that they are not well, incorporated. So sort of like the concept of fair pricing. I mean, like if you normally will talk with a regulator, it will say, well, they have a monopoly. I mean, that's the idea, that they can charge whatever they want because that's how they get incentive. So once you make you accept socially that is not acceptable, to have an excessive excessive price, then it will be easier for the regulator to address excessive pricing, because even if it's a concept, and even in antitrust law, still it's not very well used. I mean, it's very difficult, to find a court that will go for excessive prices unless there's a 2,000 rise, and so that's why it's important, the document, in the sense that creates these standards that later can be adopted.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. There was a question also about competition law. Can you use competition law to do something about high prices? And actually, Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation has started a case for the Authority on Consumers and Competition in the Netherlands against specific medicines, which was very extremely high priced. The case was started in 2018, and July this year, we actually won the case. So the company has been fined, a fine of like 19 million euros, which sounds like a lot of money. It's not very much for a pharmaceutical company, but it actually shows that sometimes using competition law can work. I also saw Katrina.
Yeah, just to add to the competition law case, I see Andre's comment in the chat there that seldom competition complaints on pharmaceuticals result in the case that you just mentioned, Sabina. However, it's important to keep in mind that the competition authorities, including at the European level, are highly under-resourced compared to the scale of industries that they need to be keeping an eye on. Mm-hmm. And I think we also need to consider, the resources that are generally available for the government to do its role to the best of its ability and be a regulator and a gatekeeper for a lot of these industries, including the pharmaceutical industry. So to come back to a few of the points that were just made, I think we need well, in this crisis in particular, we need a roadmap to give governments on behalf of civil society and law and public health experts, saying, look, at the various stages, this is what we expect of you when you're going to be investing in the development of a new medical product, which is a very legitimate thing to do in a public health crisis. We expect you to set these conditions, and this is what you should be doing to serve the public interest. And then again, at late stage, maybe advanced purchase agreements or just purchase agreements and procurement in general, that should also be made clear, because as Hans said, that was another opportunity where European governments dropped the ball. They also came into the story at a quite late stage compared to UK and US governments, where they came in much earlier and were able to steer the development and the conditions that were set, particularly for production, much better.
Okay, Thank you. Louise, do you have a short comment? Or?
No, yeah, just to point out the utility of competition law in the Dutch case against Roche, when they were refusing to use to provide information on how to make the test, and that worked, and even there was no patent involved, and we also in Chile did the same, and we trade with competition law, but the problem is the competition case is extremely long and extremely so we need to reformulate laws to make it to have more easier to do the case,
to have more impact. True. Yes, thank you. I want to go over now to a next set of questions, and that's going more deeply into the scorecard and the criteria. There are principles on accountability, commitments, transparency, equality, non-discrimination, and equity. And I hope you all had the opportunity to have a good look at the scorecard so that you can tell us which criteria do you think are the strongest and why, or which criteria are the weakest. So let's start that. And who wants to start, or shall I point out somebody to start? Like Winne, for instance, or would you like to start? Yes, thank you.
So yes, I really like going through the GCCP, especially since it felt very similar to me, since UAM has been working for a long time already on a so-called ETAF framework, which stands for Equitable Technology Access Framework. And this is really about the technology transfer that we see through between universities and pharmaceutical companies. And then we talk about all the different kinds of transfers that technology transfers that we have, like, well, licensing being commonly known as the biggest, but we also indeed, Hans already spoke about public development partnerships. We have commissioned research, spin-off companies now. It all is a very complex system, as we know. And so I think with the GCCP, I like that the international cooperation part was in it. I think this is a very crucial part, of course, since this is specifically about a pandemic and about COVID, whereas our ETAF framework is more general framework. And I was particularly fond of the accountability part. I think it's a very important aspect of a set of agreements that you build here, and it's something that we focus on with ETAF a lot as well. And it was, I think, very similar to what we talk about there. We talk about the publishing of licensing contracts, the publishing of publicly available annual reports also of universities, really about the licensing agreements that they make and who is the IP holder, these kinds of things. So I think it would make sense to make it a bit more specific, that accountability part, because we only had two sub targets now, I think, and it could be be a bit more extensive. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Who else can I? Yeah, Hans, please.
Yeah, again, I speak mostly from the experience of the Access to Medicine Index. And 12 years ago, we really started a little bit like what you're doing here with commitments. And in the Access to Medicine Index, we had actually, we looked at different things, and there were 4 groups. One group was a series of commitments. Then there was a group on transparency. Then there was a group on management, sort of governance, and there was a group on actual performance. And in the beginning, all 4 were equally weighted, or actually commitments were weighted very heavily. But now, increasingly, after 10 or 12 years, we get fed up with commitments, sort of, because they are easy to make, actually, relatively, unless they are really published. But the commitment to you in an email is fluff. So we have basically reduced the weight of the commitments more and more and more and more. Transparency is still a good one to measure, because if they're really transparent, that basically means you can find the information. But what is now, I don't know really exactly, but I think it's in the score for the Access Index, at least 50% of the value is based on actual performance. Actual performance, impact, and performance, and then triangulated with real information. So that's the first thing. So in that sense, when you ask me to look at your list, then I see the commitments, and commitments are important in the beginning, but you have to realize that you have very quickly have to go beyond that. Secondly, one useful intermediate stage could be that, okay, you write down the commitments this year, and then next year for each company you specifically check what came out of your commitment, and you give them negative points, but more or less, if they have not done nothing, or don't repeat the commitment, or have just said, yeah, we are committed without doing anything. So there is an intermediate stage that you can individually score them or really check whether they followed their commitments. But in the end, you have to look at performance. So that's my main thing there. And then one thing that's missing, which I think you can say you can say it's a commitment, but still it's an important one. An important thing for what we think for companies falls under governance. Is access to low and middle income countries, is that a real objective of your company? Have you got a company-wide access strategy for all your medicines that are relevant for low and middle income countries? Is there a company-wide thing? And is there in your board somebody who is specifically responsible for that? How high up is the visibility and responsibility for access in your company? And then you can still, so that's a good thing to measure or to ask. And then it's also, you have to realize what we say, it should not be like corporate responsibility. Oh yes, we have a good donation program and somebody is reporting to the board. I mean, that's a standard fluff answer. There's nothing. So you have to say, has your access strategy gone beyond corporate responsibility? Is it now part of your business model? That has been the big thing that we have been promoting. Yeah. And then we don't say, we want you to change your business model. No, we say, we want you to add another business model besides what you have already for America and Japan and Europe, but have you got an additional business model which is aiming at the, let me say, at the working poor in low and middle income countries, people who work, who can pay their own medicines, but at much lower prices. And this is the business model. You can earn your money, but you go to a different business model, which is basically not the low volume, high profit model, but more like a commodity model, like a generic model with big volumes and small margins. Yeah. Is that part of your official company strategy? That's a very solid question. Over.
Yeah, I agree. Totally solid. Yes. Are there criteria missing? I understand that we had a chat with Luis, and he came up with some wonderful ideas, like there should be criteria on this, that, and that. So please, Luis, can you please share with us what you?
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, the truth is that in the standards that you have some that are easy to measure, right? Whether do you have a commitment with CTAP or not, which is very clear, and we can discuss if you want, what is missing for actually people committing to CTAP, but also you have some of your standards are very difficult or impossible to measure because they are aiming to something that is hard to identify. For example, when you have the standard of whether TRIPS, I mean, does the company, goes for a protection that goes beyond TRIPS or enforce beyond TRIPS or TRIPS Plus. The problem is that there is no country in the world that today has a TRIPS, as their standard. So definitely, all European companies who have market exclusivity and data protection, blah blah, then they are, they will never be able to have a good score there. So then it's important, sort of like to put other standard that it reflects, or has the flexibility with regard to national law, and so that what will be one idea. The other is that there is a lot of behavior that is in bad faith from the companies, because what they want is to extend the rights and delay the entry of generics, and that is something that is not theoretical, but is a part of the studies that has made the EU Commission or the United States, and there is a list of behavior like evergreening patents, which means that once they are about to expire the patent, they file a secondary patent for something that is not relevant, but still they can put marketing there, or they have patent tickets, or they hide, how many patents that they have. So you never know, you have legal uncertainty or whether there is freedom to operate, and also there are misrepresentations of the other generics, so maybe it will be useful if we sort of like to have some criteria that are related to specifically this type of behavior, and then we ask civil society and governments to help to update. For example, while preparing for this presentation, I found that AstraZeneca had a lot of dead bodies in their closet, with regard to misleading and patent tickets and blah blah. So if they do this with these other drugs, why they will not do with this? So maybe a positive listing could include, for example, that the company commits or publicize all the patents and IP rights that are related to each of the specifics. They have this. They could have the listing. Also that the company commits to truthful, not misleading promotional marketing to avoid what's called product hopping. Also, a complex issue is when the company buys other company that has a competing product, and then just to kill the other, innovation. So maybe to have a commitment to develop and market timely innovations, acquiring mergers. Also, it might be important to address the issue of the companies that seek retaliation through the U.S. government or the EU Commission against third countries that want to use flexibility. So maybe we could have some standards, with related to that, and how they behave internationally with regard to. So that's I don't want to.
Oh, that's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah, right. Well, so also, for example, specifically, you say a standard will be the company commits not to file for new patents on secondary features of a pharmaceutical product. The company commits to reasonable and indispensable patent strategy, because that's the issue. Patent strategy as a way to create barriers to competitors. So then that will be rather easy to identify if we take a look how many patents AstraZeneca has put in the technology. So
Thank
you.
I see Hans raising his hand, but I still want to give the word to Kirsten because she
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. So Kirsten, can you say something about the criteria, and maybe in specific, can it be extended? Can this scorecard be extended to other essential medicines?
Yes, I'm sure it can be extended to other medicines. That wouldn't be a problem at all. But of course, for other medicines, it's also more likely competitors, and in this field, in the field of COVID, for the time being anyway, it's not it's competition maybe. You can call it on vaccines, but it's not on the therapeutic medicines. It will be, but it is difficult to sort of think about everything. Like the fact that Israel or Pfizer probably sold the vaccines to Israel in that Israel had to give their health data to Pfizer, so Pfizer bypassed the queue to other countries and left the European Union and others to wait in the queue because Israel had given access to data without asking their population probably whether they wanted to give their health data to Pfizer. But the other thing is this. These other not directly company related, like the export bans, like in the US, where you cannot export products which are not registered in the United States, and they have not given emergency authorization to AstraZeneca vaccine, and so they can sit on their stocks and not export it. But that of course hasn't got to do with the companies. It's got more to do with regulatory authorities.
Yeah, true.
And of course I like what Hans said about the role of the state, and both when it comes to imports, because that's also a bottleneck, and taxes and other things that they put on it, and yes, and today it seems to be, I'm not so updated on it, but I seem to see that there is a trend that the companies will also be in charge of the actual distribution chain within countries. And I wonder whether this is a permanent trend that in the future, for other products, it will be the manufacturer who is also in charge of distributing.
Yeah.
And I think they consider that to be a sort of advantage. So that's why they are now trying to build on this to in the future be behaving that way.
Yeah.
So then we don't build up any sort of national competence or empower the nations to do it themselves.
Yeah.
And of course, like Louis said, on marketing should probably come into this because there is heavy marketing. It's already started on the new therapeutic medicines that they start sort of marketing it before it's even been approved in any countries.
Yeah.
That could also be an issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like now to step into the second set of questions, how to make GCCP a stronger tool. And I would like to start with Luis again, because Latin America has always been a very important producer of generic medicines and has a huge potential to produce vaccines and therapeutics and to be active via CTAP. I don't think I need to explain CTAP to you. It's this mechanism under the WHO where you can share knowledge and patents and know-how with other companies. And I would like to ask Louis specifically a question about CTAP, because his organization has been researching what stimulates companies to participate in CTAP. That's true, eh, Louis?
Yes, thank you. Well, yes.
And can you comment on it for the GCCP? So what the criteria that are mentioned under international cooperation, are they enough, or is something else needed there?
Well, I mean, the criteria I think is strong, and is whether you are committed or you are not committed, right? Maybe you might have some level of commitment, as I see. I see from what we have discussed is that companies are more eager to enter in type of agreement like with the medicine patent pool, which are only for low and medium income countries. So then it will make sense to differentiate those who are willing to provide worldwide. So that could be a thing. Other is you could differentiate whether these companies are requiring a concrete incentive to participate, because also we have seen that some companies that have not yet participated in or committed to CTAP, they express interest if they get some type of support, as the main issue for a company not to participate in CTAP is that they assume that CTAP will take out the incentive of high profit that the investors will have if they invest in their drug, in their development. So at least on the part of startups or new developments, they are very concerned not to die because they don't have funding. So we have to find a way, with CTAP to link, participate in CTAP with support for those startups. Of course, when it's a drug that is already on the market, like Pfizer, then yes, of course, the only incentive will be to not to be sued, by excessive pricing by a competition authority or a legal mandate to exchange.
Okay, thank you. Hans?
Yeah, I had also a question about the CTAP. For example, in the scorecard, you say, "Are you committed to CTAP?" Well, that's a commitment again. I would change that instead. What information have you shared with CTAP? I mean, that is much more concrete and gives you an idea. Or your sub question: what information are you intending to share within the coming years, within the coming 12 months? So that's verifiable. And so make it much more concrete. That's on that one. And it brings me to some other remark which I wanted to make, and that is, some people have been saying about this lack of vaccine access, that the vaccine is a global good. But this vaccine is not a global good, because a global good is only something that is which, if you use it, it doesn't deny somebody else to use it, which in the vaccines is the case, because if you give it to one, somebody else can't get it. So it does a competition for the thing. But the knowledge is not. The knowledge is not exclusive, and having the knowledge and giving it to somebody else doesn't take away the knowledge from the first person. So we could make the case that the technical knowledge in the current world, where so many more people need the vaccine, the hoarding the knowledge is as if it's not a global good, and it's also against the whole let me say atmosphere and spirit of the patent law. The patent law is, okay, you get a monopoly in exchange for information. But the people get the monopoly, but they don't share the information, and so that's again a thing that could be picked up there, I would thought. Another thing I would like to say is, when you say how can you make best use of the scorecard, again, you can score and you can ask yourself who's going to read it, but I leave that question aside. But what two other, let me say, rather strong components of the impact model of the Access to Medicine Index is twofold. The first one is that there's, after the whole thing has been made, there's one-to-one discussions with individual companies, one-to-one companies, where the score is being explained and where it is further explain to them why they score high or low or certain things, and where the score is actually translated into specific advice to that one single company. You can do better there, you can do better there, this is good to say. Yeah. So that's one which is a very sort of, you can say, direct coaching of the company, which helps again in the advocacy. And the last thing I would like to say is that also is an increasingly strong case for the Access to Medicine Index is, for example, if you have something, a good practice that's only being done by one company out of 20, that basically is you can say is a bad score. But there, if then you can say, okay, we make a very detailed case study because the proof of concept has been made. One company is actually doing it. That means it can be done. And now if you share that example with the other companies, they actually may get an idea they never thought of, or they may want to look carefully, how the hell did they do that? So having rather detailed case studies besides your scorecard is also an important way of moving forward. Yeah, let me leave it here for the moment.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting. But not all companies see it as their responsibility to act in accordance to this human rights principles as formulated by Paul Hunt. So how does this impact the credibility or the authority of the scorecard? Who wants to say something? Vina?
Thank you. So yes, I wanted to build a bit on what Hans indeed was saying, and also to react to your reaction, like how can you make this this scorecard or this GCP a bit more tangible? I think indeed you can expect from pharmaceutical companies to really respect human rights in everything that they do, because it's in their nature to think about the profit margins that they make. However, the role of the state is very different indeed here, and the state has an obligation to respect human rights when they give their funding to the companies and to fund biomedical R&D, also to universities. What I said as well. So you really can make this a prerequisite for funding as a state. And not at the very end when you purchase the product, because it's you lose your authority in a way at the end. And it also feels like, okay, actually you kind of promote this vision of you have an R&D system where the pharmaceutical company is really the one deciding everything, and then at the end you need to kind of ask like, oh yeah, but we really want you to do this and this and this. No, you say we as a state or as a university, we are at the very beginning, we're funding this, we're playing a huge role in this whole R&D system, and we want you to do this and this, or we don't fund, or we don't collaborate with you. We don't do the development that you need to further market this product and make the profit margin that you want. So it's a really different way of starting this conversation, I think, when you do it at the end. And therefore, a toolkit like this is I think, very, very important. So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, but the states are struggling with the corporate social responsibility, how to deal with that, how to make human rights work also with companies. And we see, for instance, the OECD guidelines, they have been voluntary for years, but there is a complaint mechanism there, which makes it a bit more, gives it a few teeth to work with. So how could we maximize the policy impact of this GCCP scorecard? Can it be translated into concrete policy norms? For instance, national guidelines on corporate social responsibility, and then use the complaint mechanism from the OECD guidelines. Also, the European Union is working on a proposal for legislation on corporate social responsibility. Where do you see opportunities where we can use the scorecard in these political processes? Do you see opportunities there? Hans?
Yeah, one first thing, I really get sensitive for the word corporate social responsibility. I would advise you not to use that, because that's donations. That's donations. It's the wrong word.
Yeah.
So, but okay. Having said that, I know what you mean, but we need another word. We need another word for that. No, well, I personally think that the function the good function of the GCCP is that you have tried to formulate what is good behavior. What do we expect from companies, from responsible entrepreneurship, and then you can even split it between two. What is general good company behavior, and what is specific good company behavior in case of a pandemic, in an emergency? It's not necessarily the same, because I think in a pandemic you can actually ask for more, and you can introduce things for this occasion, like trip flexibility or something like that, which you would not normally ask from them. So that way, and I would say, repeating what I said before, the wish list aspect is the good thing. So your scores should basically reflect. Should only be there if they reflect desired behavior. That should be a starting point, and then you should really be as specific as possible. Let me give you one real life example. In the Extra Medicine Index, we used to ask how many licenses have you voluntarily issued. Now, and that was very difficult to measure. You got all sorts of numbers. I mean, it was not very useful information until we really spoke with the patent pool, and they helped us understand that there is good licenses and bad licenses. So now in the current versions, already since a few years, we very specifically in the methodology describe what is a good license, and which good licenses will give you good scores, and which bad fluffy licenses will not. You see, so again, the more specific you are in what you are measuring, that basically means the more specific you are in what you want them to do. And that can be a standalone document. You can make a 5-page document. This is what we think is responsible behavior in the case of COVID. Yeah. And then you list all the things, and then you're going to measure it afterwards.
Good, thank you. I had wanted to give more speakers the possibility to speak about this in particular, but we have already reached the moment where everybody can do their concluding statement. It's a 2-minute statement that you can make. I hope you prepared it, because I will have to cut you short if needed. So I don't know who wants to start, or shall I point to somebody? Okay, so I'm going to point to Luis. Can you do your...
Thank you.
Fine.
Well, yes, fine. No, I think that as I started, this document might serve as a basis for a policy that should be implemented by not only the companies, by the government, and therefore my aim is that this document present actionable items that might be later, used as a source for a good adoption of regulations.
Yeah, thank you very much. Who wants to be next? Kirsten?
Yes, I haven't got much to say. I'm just jumped into it this week, so I'm still learning. But it's been good listening to both Louis and Hans and others, and so I very much are in line with all of them. So I don't think I will add anything at this stage. But it was great for me to be introduced this way.
Yeah, and would you have some recommendations for us, Kirsten, or would you still have some recommendations, like look at this, or this is, you forgot something about?
Not now, I think. No, but I can always mail comments. But otherwise, I support very much what Hans and Louis has been saying. So
yeah,
so I think we are very much in line.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, next will be Hans.
Okay, well, I've spoken a lot, so I will be very brief. No, I won't repeat what I said, but there's 2 more things, 2 questions which I want to leave with you without expecting an answer right now. And the first one is, you have to think for yourself, what do you do that goes beyond the Access to Medicine Index? And don't repeat. Companies are totally fed up with indexes and feeding and all sort of skills. So there's too many of them, and it sort of dilutes it. So what specifically do you do what the Access to Medicine Index does not do? And my advice for you for consideration is focus really on the pandemic issue, so the emergency issue, and on COVID. That will probably give you a niche that offers something extra that's worth doing. And the last question is, and I said it already, but you don't have to whom are you speaking, and what is your change model? And so you have to formulate your change model. Whom do you want to change, and how do you want to achieve that change? Is it investors? Is it companies? Is it governments? And you really have to think, what is my change model? Whom am I speaking to? Over.
Thank you. Very relevant questions. Okay, Wime, do you want to be next?
Yes, sure. Yes, thank you again for being here and listening and participating in this very needed discussion. Again, I think I will emphasize again that it's very important that, first of all, we need more of these toolkits. So we need more of these ways to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for what they're doing and what the impact of what they're doing is, specifically the public health impact. And I think the COVID pandemic is a very needed moment to do that. 2 things that I would have to say is, one, that we need to remember that during this pandemic, what I was seeing again and again is that we are repeating this idea of the role that pharmaceutical companies are playing in this whole world of research and development. This is one role, and there are different partners and different actors in it, and they're not the one player in it. And it was so, like, when we talk about AstraZeneca, no, it's AstraZeneca and Oxford that together made this, and the public funding that came in it, which was huge. So it's basically citizens, Oxford and AstraZeneca that participated in creating these vaccines. And two, that we need to continue thinking of how we, or continue rethinking how we look at knowledge, what Hans already pointed out, that when we have this IP scheme, we make knowledge artificially scarce and not like we treat it as something that is abundantly and that we can share abundantly. So I'll leave it there.
Lovely, thank you very much. Katrina, you're the last person to speak. You have been working on the first version of the scorecard, so I think I would like to give you a little bit more time to react to all the things that have been said. Please.
Thanks, Sabina. So I have basically three kind of takeaways from this conversation, which has been really rich and insightful. The first is, of course, that states have a primary responsibility to really shape the environment that companies are operating in. And this conversation has just hit home for me that we should actually be making a scorecard in tandem with other activities oriented towards states to make them aware, hey, if you want companies to act in certain ways, then you should take these actions. And that's not necessarily something that Verantwoording needs to take on, but we have this rich network of partners, some of whom are on this call, and maybe that's something we could work on together, a sort of roadmap for companies and states. What actions do we expect? Because perhaps targeting only one or the other and not doing it in tandem isn't getting us to where we want to be in terms of access. The second take home I have is that there were a number of really useful practical recommendations that I heard on this call. Monitoring changes over time, asking companies to reflect on whether they've met their commitment and how, specifying the responsible behavior that's accepted or rather that's expected and would get a higher score. These sorts of practical things, I think, can only help us to make this a more useful and a more impactful tool. And the third point that I would raise is actually something that we didn't address a lot, but maybe we can do that at another forum. And that is that Paul Hunt's 2007 guidelines on which this tool was based were responsive to that era, but not to the era of a viral pandemic. And so what we're missing in Paul Hunt's guidelines are things like, what are companies' responsibilities with regards to production? What are companies' responsibilities with regards to trade secrets and know-how? And what are their responsibilities with regards to fair pricing? These are three major issues in the current pandemic that I think we as Verantwoording would be well served to spend some time developing the legal arguments to bring these issues into the discourse of human rights responsibilities and develop the sort of legal human rights grounding that's needed to make the reasonable argument that these are reasonable things to expect from companies. So that's maybe a call to action I can leave us with, and turn it back to you, Sabina. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, herewith I will end this panel discussion. I thank you very much, Hans and Kirsten and Louise and Katrina and Winne for making this a rich discussion. And I hope that the audience also thought it was very interesting. I've seen some questions come by, and I hope they were all answered to your satisfaction. And after thanking you all, I will go back to Tegan. Yes.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you everyone for joining today. This was such an interesting discussion, and I'm sure we all got many ideas to implement in the upcoming project and just developing all of these ideas. So to follow up, we have we're aiming to publish several documents and also hold a follow-up webinar when we publish our new scorecard. So keep up to date with that, and we'll let you know when that happens. And we would love to just keep in touch. And so please join the follow-up event. But also, if you want more information about our work, you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on our various social media platforms. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact Rosalind, but also Emily, and of course anyone else on the panel or on the board. And that's all. So thank you so much for everyone for joining, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you.